We'll be going over. There we go, and it's recorded. The Fair Start for Kids Act, growing trauma informed and healing centered practices with our partners DCYF. They will be leading the conversation. But first, I'd like to start with land acknowledgement, and I'll let Leah go ahead and lead that. Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here today. I would like to share. I'm going to skip over that. I'd like to share a little bit about the Yakima Nation, which is where I am living on, the lands of the Yakima Nation, and just some history about them and some of the things that have happened within their tribe. So in the late 1800s, the map I'm showing here on the screen, I'm going to refer to it in just a second. In the late 1800s, surveying errors and misplaced treaty maps caused the government to include more than 120,000 acres of Yakima land in the Mount Rainier Forest Reserve. And so they took away that amount of land from the Yakima Nation and included it in the National Forest. In 1908, the land became part of what's now known as the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. So this is Mount Adams right here. This is the larger forest area, and all over here is Yakima Indian Reservation land. And so my understanding is that when that was taken away, it was 120,000 acres that belonged to the Yakima Indian Reservation or Yakima Indian tribe, and then instead got taken away and put into the National Forest lands. And so while a 1966 Federal Indian Claims Commission ruling found that the land was rightfully part of the Yakima Reservation, the U.S. government refused to return the land, agreeing only to a monetary settlement. However, on May 23rd, 1972, President Richard Nixon signed an executive order returning the Yakima Nation the eastern slope of the more than 12,200 foot tall volcanic Mount Adams, revered by the Yakima as one of its most important landmarks. So it was returned to them 50 years ago. So on September 23rd of this last year, 2022, leaders and citizens of the Confederated Tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation came together with representatives of other Pacific Northwest tribes and non-native community members to commemorate the 50th anniversary of one of the first examples of a tribal nation reclaiming lost land. So it was actually on May 23rd, 1972, the land was returned to them, and they celebrated on September 23rd. And at that time, President Richard Nixon signed an executive order returning to the Yakima Nation the eastern slope of Mount Adams, so over here to the Yakima Nation. The actual anniversary of the executive order was exactly 4 months before the commemoration. The celebration included drumming, dancing by Yakima youth and young dancers from the Makah Nation, and speeches from tribal leaders and others who played a role in the fight. Attendees enjoyed a meal of salmon, venison, huckleberries, corn, and pumpkin pie ahead of the tribe's annual National Indian Days opening ceremonies in powwow. I thought that was a great example of something that's actually happening locally. And I thought it was pretty cool that it's one of the first examples of tribal lands being returned to a tribal organization. So I wanted to share that. I didn't say this at the beginning, but I live in Ellensburg, so on the east side of the state.
Thank you for sharing, Leah. I appreciate that. If you go into the next slide for me, we'll just let this serve as a reminder for our community agreement. So starting and ending on time. I think we've got the start part. So let's make sure we end on time. Make sure you're interacting through the chat. You can raise your hand, type something in the chat. We'll be monitoring that, and unmute if you'd like. And when you do unmute, just be mindful of background noise. Stay present, and make sure to create space for multiple truths and norms, and be kind to yourself and others. And I think we'll have a good field staff webinar. So with that said, if there's not any questions or comments, I will hand it over to our partners at DCYF.
Hi, folks. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so excited to see so many of you too. My name is Jess. I am the Trauma-Informed and Healing-Centered Care Manager at the DCYF Early Learning Division in the Teaching and Learning team. And so we have a really exciting opportunity here through the Fair Start for Kids Act to do some very cool stuff with trauma-informed and healing-centered supports. And so that's why I'm here today, is to talk to you about that work. So here in a second, I will pull up PowerPoint so I can keep track of what I'm talking about, and you'll have some lovely images to look at. And we'll also be asking you to put down your questions at the end of today's talk in a Jamboard as well. So we'll talk you through what that looks like here at the end, so we don't crash Jamboard with our sheer numbers. And so also I'm here with a couple of DCYF. So just to acknowledge that Mallory Lopez is here, and she's going to help me present information if somehow I falter or I get stuck on something. And also Rachel Brown Kendall is here to support us as well. So if anything comes up, if those folks pop in, don't think it's too weird. So you see Mal coming in and saying hi. So with that, I'm going to share my PowerPoints and we'll get going talking about what's happening here with trauma-informed supports. You folks see that PowerPoint okay? Maybe a thumbs up. Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is just some background on the Fair Start for Kids Act, and also DCYF's efforts to grow trauma-informed and healing-centered supports for the early childhood workforce. We're also going to talk about some foundational concepts and principles behind trauma-informed and healing-centered supports and care in general, because I find that whenever I enter into a new room of people, it can be helpful for us to cultivate a shared understanding and a shared language of what trauma-informed care is. Too often I walk into places and people are like, trauma-informed care, that's just the flavor of the month, right? What are you even talking about? So we'll talk just a little bit about what trauma-informed and healing-centered care is, so we can grow a shared understanding of that. And then, of course, we'll talk about the Fair Start for Kids Act and what it directs DCYF to do in terms of growing supports for professionals and coaches who are leading the work on the ground. So we'll get into the details around that. And then, as I noted at the end of today's conversation, we'll ask you to work in groups and Jamboards to put down your questions that you think providers may have around this effort, as there are quite a few moving pieces. So we want to try to collect your thoughts and your questions at the end of today, and then be able to succinctly answer them for you. So with that, and also I want to tell you that this slide deck that I'm presenting with you today will also be something that you folks can share with providers as you talk to them about what the Fair Start for Kids Act means with regard to trauma-informed and healing-centered supports. And so as we talk about in healing-centered care language, we are feeding two birds with one scone with this presentation, and that you too will be able to use this later when you discuss with providers what the Fair Start for Kids Act trauma-informed care stuff looks like. So keep that in mind. I will be sharing it with your colleagues, with Patty, who's been super helpful in setting me up today. And so you will have this accessible for yourselves as well. So with that, let's jump right into it. So the Fair Start for Kids Act is a historic investment in the early childhood system. And so I actually will tell you just anecdotally, it's actually what brought me from Montana to Washington State, in that I saw this great opportunity to grow trauma-informed and healing-centered supports in Washington through the Fair Start for Kids Act. So it's actually a fairly huge deal, right? And so when we drill into the Fair Start for Kids Act, there are all sorts of sections of it, and there's a lot of different stuff going on. But what I'm talking about today is section 304 of the Fair Start for Kids Act, which directs DCYF to do some stuff to support early childhood providers so they can be more trauma informed, right? And so as the legislation discusses specifically, if you were to pull up the legislation, it would look a lot like this slide in front of us, absent Bill here in the corner, who some of you of a certain age may remember, Bill from After School Specials. They say I'm just a Bill, etc. So I'm dating myself with that. But anyway, what the legislation says specifically is that beginning July 1, DCYF shall begin providing supports to aid eligible providers with trauma-informed care specifically. And so those supports may be used by eligible providers for the following purposes. And I'll talk about who the eligible providers are here in a minute. But the purposes that we're talking about today are for additional compensation for individual staff who have an infant and early childhood mental health or other child development specialty credential, And again, we'll talk about what that looks like here in a few minutes. And then also for trauma-informed professional development and training. So we'll dig into the details around that here in just a minute and what that looks like on the ground. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about who are those providers and coaches, right? So the legislation says eligible providers, and legislation can be a little challenging to read in that we have to pop around to different sections and lots of words, right? So we'll try to make that understandable here. And so eligible providers in this instance specifically are referencing an employee or owner of a licensed or certified child care center or outdoor nature-based care center accepting state subsidy. That's a lot of S's. Or an employee or owner of a licensed family home provider accepting state subsidy. And then C, a contractor or provider of the early childhood education and assistance program, so ECAP folks, or the early ECAP folks. And then D, a licensed exempt childcare program, and also EA coaches. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what this looks like for coaches here toward the latter part of our discussion, but coaches are included in the legislation, which means coaches are eligible for these supports. And again, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. So I want to talk, as I noted, about some of these key concepts of trauma-informed care, because really this is the heart of what we're getting at, right? And I think it's important when, especially when money's involved and all sorts of moving pieces and government bureaucracy, it's really nice to focus on the heart of what we're up to. And so at the heart of what we're doing here is growing trauma-informed approaches. So we're working to make it less likely that we will re-traumatize children and families, essentially is what we're talking about here. But then it's like, okay, great, what do you talk, like, what is trauma-informed? And so one way to think about what trauma-informed is with these 4 R's, which are up on the screen here. This is one model, and this is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is fairly well respected in the world of trauma-informed care. SAMHSA, as we call the entity, the government entity, puts out quite a bit of best practice literature on how to do trauma-informed work. And so this is a model that I talk quite a bit about when we're talking about trauma-informed care. You can think about it as essentially a roadmap to the provision of trauma-informed care, or the increasing provision of trauma-informed care. So I'm going to talk through what these R's mean and how that shapes a trauma-informed organization. You know, we can think of these R's as shaping a trauma-informed entity, organization, a program, or even I think about it as an individual too. I try to embody these R's myself as an individual. So with that said, a trauma-informed entity first realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands the potential paths for recovery. So that's a biggie, right? So a trauma-informed entity, first and foremost, just realizes that trauma is a challenge, right? Many of us have it. Most Americans have at least one traumatic early event in our lives. So that's the starting point when we're working to become trauma-informed, right? It's just realizing the widespread impact of trauma. And then secondly, a trauma-informed entity recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. So those we walk alongside, right? It could be that, you know, I'm exhibiting trauma symptoms at times. And so somebody I'm working with, for them to be trauma-informed, they're recognizing that me having potentially an outburst in a meeting, maybe that's a trauma response. Maybe just as having a response to trauma, right? And so that's the second R. And when we think about little kids, that's even more clear, right? We see little kids who are acting out in classrooms, and oftentimes those issues, which, you know, maybe adults perceive as bratty behavior or whatnot, that could be very well be a trauma response. So the second R is simply to just recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in those we walk alongside, right? And then the third R is that a trauma-informed entity responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, right? So that's what DCYF is working to do with our partners right now, and with you folks, is we're working to respond to the prevalence of trauma by incorporating the best information we can find about how prevalent trauma is and how we work with children and families who have experienced trauma. So we're actually really embracing that respond, that third R right now. And then the fourth R is a trauma-informed entity specifically actively works to resist re-traumatization. So whatever we do, we just don't want to make it worse, right? And so that seems fairly straightforward. So those are the 4 R's. We want to realize the widespread impact of trauma and also potential paths for recovery. We want to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma and those we walk alongside and ourselves. We want to respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into everything we do. And we want to actively resist re-traumatization. So that's what we're talking about with the 4 R's. Now, when we get a little bit closer, so while I was talking about the 4 R's as being like a roadmap to the increasing provision of trauma-informed care, when we talk about the 6 key principles of trauma-informed care, these can be thought of maybe as road signs as we're getting closer, right? We're getting closer to the provision of trauma-informed care. And so commonly accepted principles of trauma-informed care are highlighted up on the screen here. As I noted, this actually came from SAMHSA as well, in addition to those 4 R's. And so each one of these key principles of trauma-informed care that we're looking at up on the screen actually anchor a host of practices, right? So for example, safety, which is the first key principle of trauma-informed care. For that key principle, we can think of practices, including being at eye level with a young person, for example, right? When we're working with a young person, we don't want to be towering over them and intimidating or using my big person voice as I do during presentations. I would have a very different voice if I were talking to a child and I was being trauma informed, right? Similarly, in an early childhood classroom, it would be making sure kids have a safe space to store their belongings, right? Or we have orderly transitions from activities, between activities. And so many of these things that I'm talking about, I understand that are already being done. And so that's one of the cool things about this effort underway, is that we know that many of the practices are trauma-informed or are already being embraced and performed in the early learning workforce among coaches today. And so one of the cool things about this opportunity is we can really name them. Hey, that's great, you're doing this, that's super trauma-informed, and we can grow your trauma-informed practice by maybe in trustworthiness and transparency. We can be a little bit more clear about our expectations of a young person or of a family. Or maybe we can collaborate and engage in mutuality a little bit better while we're doing developmental screening, you know? And so those are things to think about as we think about these core concepts and principles of trauma-informed care, excuse me. And so these key principles are really anchors to all of the work. Equity is very significant. There is no trauma-informed care without an understanding of equity and historical trauma and also historical resilience. So really just to highlight that key principle as being so significant. I mean, there are 6 principles, they're all very important, but equity is just vital to this conversation. So to highlight that. So those are some key concepts and principles. I'm going to highlight one more theme and one more concept before we start getting into the real nuts and bolts of what this legislation means for providers on the ground. What I do want to touch base about is a really important concept called the healing-centered approach. This is a relatively new concept or framework that came out in 2018, so it's fairly new to the trauma-informed world. However, it's gained a lot of steam because it's really helpful in terms of the way we conceptualize trauma-informed work. It highlights the fact that this effort is not externally facing. So for DCYF, for example, we can't just be telling people, if we're going to be trauma-informed, we can't be like, you need to do X, Y, and Z. You know, DCYF actually needs to embrace this too, and to embody those key principles that I just talked about. Also, we need to think about the fact that we want to think about strengths-based approaches as well. The healing-centered approach focuses a lot more on strengths than traditionally had been a focus of trauma-informed care. So oftentimes when we talk about moving to a trauma-informed approach, we talk about instead asking a child, for example, what's wrong with you? We ask, what happened to you, right? And so that's how for a long time we talked about moving to trauma-informed approach, is moving from asking like, what's wrong with you, kid? You're a brat or whatever, to instead asking what happens, right? So we're cultivating a greater understanding. However, with the healing-centered approach, we even take that one step further and we instead ask, what's right with you? So that's just it's an interesting evolution. And I think it's important, especially when we're dealing with big systems like we are here in Washington, because it highlights the fact that we are all in this effort together, that in order to effectively intervene in trauma and to help folks recover and heal, we need to engage in this as a collective experience, right? So just in case folks maybe don't have their eyes on the screen, or perhaps have maybe whatever, I'm going to read the healing-centered approach definition out loud for us too, so everybody hears it. And so a healing-centered approach is holistic. It involves culture, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. A healing-centered approach views trauma not simply as an individual isolated experience, but rather highlights the ways in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively. So again, I just really love to highlight this because healing can actually happen in these meetings, right? Healing happens in relationship. Healing happens in the way I work with my colleagues. Healing happens in the way you work with providers and the way providers work with children and families. So just to really emphasize that this is a really important part of this conversation and that we're all in this together, okay? And so with that, I'm going to start getting into the details of the legislation and what we're up to at DCYF, because you're like, oh, Jess, that's great. You have all these really lofty ideas. What does that even mean? So with that, let's talk about where we are now and where we've been and how we're growing these supports. So where we are today is when I arrived here, I told you I moved here from Montana a year ago. When I arrived here, I was like, holy smokes, where do I even start, right? And so I took an inventory of all of the curriculum, all of the curricula that I could get my hands on that was kind of trauma-informed or presented itself as being trauma-informed. And I itemized, so to what extent does Washington Pyramid Model, for example, align with the key principle of safety? To what extent does Pyramid Model further equity? To what extent does Pyramid Model talk about collaborating and engaging mutuality with families? And I saw the Pyramid Model specifically was great with trauma-informed care, covered all of those bases, right? Similarly, Conscious Discipline did a really good job of covering a lot of those bases with the trauma-informed principles and concepts. Filming Interactions to Nurture Development did a really good job. And so what we did is I, started going through this list of stuff, and then I went to our advisory group. We had an external advisory group comprised of subject matter experts, people from all across, the early learning system, higher ed, coaches, our partners, certainly with CCA, were there, and elsewhere. We had folks participating from elsewhere too, and asked them, what do you think about this list of trainings that we have that we think are fairly trauma informed? Should we be working maybe to recognize them with awards per the Fair Start for Kids Act? And they're like, yeah, those trainings sound pretty good. What about X training and Y training? And so we're still reviewing some trainings. And then we also went to a provider design team in June. We convened a group of providers specifically and asked them how we should deal with the Fair Start for Kids Act, as it tells DCYF to grow these supports, but what does that look like specifically? And so we heard from providers specifically that they wanted, for example, a tiered award structure in terms of getting the Fair Start for Kids Act awards out the door. They said that we should have like a smaller payment, a lower amount, and then a higher amount. They also talked about some specific trainings that they wanted to see. And we also heard from them what would be appropriate to create in a foundational trauma-informed care training too. So we worked with them to put together a prototype of supports that they said were needed. And that's part of what's shaping what we're talking about today in terms of how these awards will be distributed specifically, right? Some other stuff we've been up to is we're creating a foundational training because as much as, when I did that inventory of all of the different trainings that's, that are happening in the early learning system, when I did that, I realized that none of the trainings actually talked about those key principles that I just talked about. None of those trainings really talked about the 4 R's, right? So those foundational concepts, while they were embodied in practices, we didn't actually talk about where they came from. So DCYF has been working to create a foundational training that we are going to incorporate into childcare basics, not adding to the hours of childcare basics, but we will incorporate because we think that it's really super important that everybody has just a foundational training on what are these key concepts and principles, right? So that's one thing we've been up to. I think I noted earlier today, or maybe it was just when I was talking with Patty, we're engaging in rulemaking around our Fair Start for Kids Act supports too. So that means that we have just like a heightened level of complexity in terms of how we can communicate externally about what we're up to. I do anticipate our rulemaking around Fair Start for Kids Act awards will be going to public comment, hopefully in the next week or two. So that's my best guess. And when that happens, it'll be easier for us to communicate to the world about what we're doing. So just to acknowledge that there's been limited communication to everybody externally because we have so many moving pieces. Like we have some union discussions. We also have the, public comments in the rulemaking and things like that. So we'll be working hopefully to remedy that and telling the world about what we're up to very soon, in addition to telling you about this today. Another thing that we're up to is we're working on creating individual knowledge, skills, and abilities, like individual standards for for people that show that we are trauma informed. So competencies specifically, right? So, you know, I noted that when I showed up, I took this inventory of the trainings and I asked a bunch of people, are these trainings trauma informed? Should we give people cash money for taking these trainings? But that's not really the best way to recognize people for performing trauma informed and healing centered work, right? It's not a super objective way of doing it. Like somebody can take a training, but it doesn't mean that they're trauma informed on the ground, right? And so what we're doing now is we're working with subject matter experts from all across, you know, systems and asking them, what does it really look like in terms of specific practices to be trauma informed? And so that's one effort underway right now, is really articulating some of those specific practices, like what I noted earlier, you know, making sure that we're using a calm and quiet voice when we're working with people, with kids, especially coming down to their level, you know, or how do we have classroom management in such a way that conveys safety? Are we using jargon-free language, things like that, right? So that's what those individual competencies are starting to look like. I anticipate those will be ready by the early part of fiscal 24 for review, you know, more discussion around those competencies and how they'll be operationalized. I'm not sure exactly just yet. So with that, let's look at the tiered award structure, like which trainings are we recognizing for financial awards? I hope you can see that. I realize the font is kind of small. It makes me want to put my eyeglasses on. And I will talk us through this because again, it looks a little like a lot of stuff is going on here. But I noted some of those trainings and how we came to decide on which trainings would be recognized with financial awards. And so you can see them up on the screen. And again, you will have the slideshow made available to you when you're working with providers. So you won't have to just like wing it when you're talking to people. You'll have this as a resource. And so what we did is you can see that there's this tiered structure, specifically on top for the specialty credential. We are currently we will be awarding individuals with a bachelor's degree or higher in early childhood mental health, $1,200. And that's the cap always for any kind of trauma-informed care award will always be a $1,200 cap, regardless of if you get an 800 and then you take another training. So to note that if I took, for example, conscious discipline, I would get an $800 award if I was an eligible provider. And then if I went on to take prepare for care, I would only get another $400. So that's just all to say that we are capping all awards at $1,200. So you can't do more than that. Now, with regard to this bachelor's degree in infant and early childhood mental health, or some kind of, you know, there are different naming conventions around that, but it's basically a bachelor's degree in infant early childhood mental health. Sometimes it's stated a little bit differently, but I think you get the idea there. We are contemplating adding different college degrees specifically. That has yet to be decided. And when that happens, when that conversation happens, it'll be a broad conversation across groups of stakeholders and with our partners. Right now, we're only recognizing that one because it's spoken to in the legislation specifically. In the Fair Start for Kids Act, it talks very specifically about infant early childhood mental health credentials. So, so that's why that's up there and on top. And then with regard to emerging and intensive, so you can see we have this lower level tier, which is typically it's fewer hours. And then we move to a more intensive training level, which is more hours and more intensive, right? So when we're talking about that specifically, we have the Washington Pyramid model, which is will be eligible for $800. And also just to highlight, it's the recent update. So there's new pyramid model content as of 2021 put out by the Herring Center and Cultivate. And the reason we're recognizing the new pyramid model content as opposed to the old is the new content is much more trauma informed and it's much more focused on equity. So it was redesigned specifically so that it's more focused on trauma informed stuff. So it's much more in our wheelhouse, right? And then moving on to conscious discipline, the two conscious discipline trainings that we're recognizing our Strong Start and building resilient schools and homes. And to acknowledge, I'm acknowledging a question that I can hear already, even though you haven't said it, I hear maybe Mika's voice in my head. So what we're doing here with the Strong Start is we will recognize going forward completion of either one of these training offerings specifically, right? And with regard to pyramid model, again, I noted that The pyramid model that we're looking at is from 2021, the new training content. And so going forward is what I'm talking about with awards that will be recognized. And I'll talk about retroactive here in a minute because I saw a comment about that in our chat. But going forward, these trainings will be the new instructional practices 1 and 2 from pyramid model, conscious discipline, one of these, and it has to be completed. There's no like portion of the training completed. So they have to be all completed. Like you have to take all of the contents and complete it. And then mobility mentoring for ECAP and early ECAP, find specifically filming interactions to nurture development, prepare for care, 2 or more sessions of prepare for care specifically. And then we have a new content coming up from Voices of Tomorrow that is developing social emotional skills in Somali. And then, so those are the ones that we're talking about in emerging trainings. And then with regard to intensive trainings, we're looking at trauma-informed care series from Cultivate Learning. It's fairly new content that came out within the last year or so. And it's all 4 sessions again. So that'll be recognized with an intensive award. 4 or more sessions of Prepare for Care specifically will be recognized with the greater award, the more intensive award. And then there's some cool new content coming out from, again, Voices of Tomorrow on prenatal and infant mental health provided in Somali. And that'll be eligible for the more intensive training. It's a hefty offering. I think it's 20 hours. And then for implementation sites for pyramid model, those folks will also be eligible for a $1,200 award. So just to note that individuals at a pyramid model implementation site will have a heavier lift than those who simply take instructional practices 1 and 2. And then moving on, eventually we'll have the pyramid model prevent, teach, and reinforce for young children available. And then folks can potentially receive an award for that too, keeping in mind that we will have a cap. So what I talked about just now is what's happening going forward, right? Now, retroactively, we will be giving out awards too. And so I saw a couple of questions coming in about that. And that's where it gets a little more confusing, but I'm going to try to articulate it in a way that makes sense. So retroactively, we will be providing awards for these trainings highlighted here. So for example, if you took conscious discipline, strong start, SEL foundations and resiliency in infants and toddlers, and you completed that training, at least, 10 hours of that training specifically, retroactively by a state approved trainer, or one acknowledged by DCYF, then you potentially will be eligible for an award. So keep that in mind. And we're making that cutoff as 10 hours because we know that in multiple instances, conscious discipline was delivered in like 20 hours of it or 15 hours of it in like 5 installments. And it was really hard for us to figure out what was going on there. So we're cutting that off at 10 hours. So if individuals took 10 hours from a state approved trainer or a DCYF sanctioned trainer, then they can receive potentially, if they're one of the eligible providers, they can receive that financial award. So that's what's happening with the conscious discipline, and that's one of the more complicated ones. And so hopefully that makes sense. And then with regard to some of these other ones, again, mobility mentoring, that's going to be for ECAP folks. So not necessarily super relevant for you, but again, we'll be making those awards retroactive. Find also retroactive, prepare for care, also retroactive. And I see some stuff coming in through the chat. So providers that speak languages other than English. Yeah, and as much as I told you, we'll take questions at the end of today. I'm going to try to answer some of these broadly. So yes, for providers who speak something other than English, they can have a translator present if they want to take the trainings again. We are also working to make all of the contents we can available in various languages, including the pyramid model and, conscious discipline. I know there's some work happening to make that more applicable to Spanish speaking populations. We are providing these new trainings in Somali as well to hopefully make some of these trainings more accessible. And then pyramid model content and some of the new TIC stuff is definitely going to be translated too. So really working to make these things accessible to everybody. Yeah, and Mal is saying too that she's going to track these questions coming through and we'll follow up in writing with answers. And I know Patty and CCA are tracking as well. Again, I didn't want to jump too deeply into these questions because I just knew there would be so many of them. So it'll be easier for us if, Mal is taking them down from the chat. And then at the end of today too, we'll ask you to work in the Jamboard to take some of the questions, to write down some of your questions. So yeah, so again, hearing what is the time frame with respect to past trainings, how far back does the retroactive go? If the trainings were provided with learning application supports and by a state approved trainer or a state sanctioned trainer, then and with an eligible provider, and it satisfies all of our policy and stuff like that, then the awards are going back to, in some instances, we're looking at maybe 2019, I think, for conscious discipline, and some of the data we're looking at like that. And for filming interactions to nurture development, some of them go back a little further, I think. There is a deadline to spend these funds. That's a great question. We are working to spend these funds by the end of this fiscal year. We don't know what our funding looks like after this fiscal year. So through June 30th. It remains up to the legislature what happens after this fiscal year. And so, as we all know, there's legislative deliberations happening currently, and I can't speak to what happens after this fiscal year, which is kind of a bummer, but like that. Seeing a question about prevent, teach, reinforce, redone too. I think PTRYC has stayed the same. We will recognize that it doesn't have to be, it's not been redone by Herring Center or Cultivate. So we'll recognize the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations trainings there. These trainings are provided free of cost. DCYF is footing the bill for these trainings. And wow, how much of the 1.1 billion in FSCA is going to compensation awards? I can't speak to that. That's beyond the scope of my, like, the Fair Start for Kids Act is huge. I can tell you that my little part of the Fair Start for Kids Act, we're working to release $2.2 million to providers. We are paying for making the trainings accessible. Okay. So with that, I'm going to start moving on. We have some additional ground to cover here today. With that, let's talk about some other important details here. So, you know, the whole deal is we want to make sure providers know what's going on, right? So we want to try to help support providers so they can understand what's happening with these awards. And again, with the questions that maybe didn't get answered verbally from me today, we will answer them in writing. And again, we're going to ask you to write down your questions at the end of the time I'm talking at you. We'll ask you to write them down in Jamboard too. So specifically, some ways that we can assist providers. And this is all keeping in mind that we'll have a bunch of communication coming out soon. We spell this out in a couple different communication documents, and you'll have this PowerPoint too. So we will be providing you with, you know, talking points, etc. So coaches can assist providers in knowing how training is recorded in their professional records specifically. So we are requiring that training be recorded in the Merit Workforce Registry, and also education too. So that is one thing that you can help knowing about. You know, we need to make sure that the training is recorded in Merit, because we need to have an accurate record of what's happening, right? Also, we want folks to know about where the trainings are at, right? So you can help people know how to register for trainings and how to learn about what trainings are eligible. I will tell you that we've been putting together some templates in Merit, which I'll talk about here more. So we're working on making sure we have uniform names for the various trainings, because that hasn't always been the case with DCYF. So we're working to make sure our naming conventions are standardized, and also noting on those training templates that the trainings could be eligible for a Fair Start for Kids Act awards. So as providers are poking around Merit, it'll hopefully be easier to find what trainings are eligible for those awards. And then knowing also the process for confirming or verifying employment in Merit, that's a biggie too. So that's one way that you can help providers in making sure that they can access their awards if they're eligible. And we will again be putting out additional like written information on that. So you have that handy, you have kind of a cheat sheet or a Cliff's Notes there. And then also learning how to obtain a statewide vendor number for education awards. That'll be one strategy, one way you can help specifically providers so they can get their awards. And then just to highlight too, that to received any kind of training or education award for providers specifically, individuals are required to have a workforce registry account with a STARS ID number. So just to be really clear about that. So I noted this just a minute ago. So training is recorded. So this is how we're doing the recording of the training is in Merit, the workforce registry specifically. And so one thing that we've been really working diligently to get done is changing up our training templates. So they have consistent naming conventions, and they have consistently language that notes that the trainings could be eligible for Fair Start for Kids Act awards. So the idea is that state approved trainers will use the DCYF uniform templates for each of the trainings for Pyramid Model or TIC Cultivate, for example. And that way we'll have just a, and then we'll have trainers assigned to those different training templates. And then also individuals must complete all DCYF recognized course content. So I noted that earlier. It's really important that people finish the content. I've received, even though we haven't gone public with our communications in a big way yet, I'm already getting a lot of questions from people like, well, I took 80% of the training. Can I still get my award? And the answer to that is no. People need to finish the trainings in order to receive the awards. And then also, providers will see in their professional record and Merit eligible training. So we want to make sure, for example, when we start communicating about this with providers, that they can look in their professional record in Merit to see to what extent the training that they think is eligible is actually recorded. So that's one way we can prepare providers to make sure they're ready to receive their awards. I do want to note too that it'll be the training organizations, the DCYF contracted training partners that will be distributing the awards. So what we're doing is working with them to share information, and then DCYF will compile a list of those individuals who are eligible based on the Merit Workforce Registry information. And then we will share with CCA WA, for example, information on who we found to be eligible for an award for completing conscious discipline. And so we'll be communicating with the respective training organizations about that. So that's a little bit of background how that'll work too. And then just checking in. Moving here. Thanks for listening to me just talk with you for 45 minutes. It's a little weird just to talk at you for 45 minutes. And then, so I noted this a little bit ago, is that we'll be providing written communications, the slide presentation we can share with you, we will share with you, so you have this handy to discuss what's happening. So we're really working to make sure you have all of the information you need, so it's not like, what's happening? And so the communications documents will continue to be forthcoming, including this one, which I've already discussed with Patty, releasing to you folks in the not too distant future. So a way to know about and register for the trainings, the communications from DCYF and the respective training organizations will be coming out. And then also use the Find Training search tool in Merit for approved options. That's a good way to detect those trainings, to track down some of those trainings to be eligible in the future if you want to take something. And then check the training listed in Merit states that it's eligible for an award. So I was talking about that a little bit and how we're adjusting the training templates to make it so so it's easy to spot when trainings are eligible. So